times on this call. We're here today to talk about the rise and risk of third-party scripts in the modern website. It's basically some really, first of its kind empirical research that's included in the 2024 Verizon Payment Security Report. It's obviously a topic that's of interest to you, most likely framed around the concerns for the need to put eSkimming security controls in place by the March 31st deadline of next year to retain PCI DSS compliance. But there's broader security concerns outside of compliance checkbox that I really want to make sure we address and we'll dig into in this session. Really, the intent is to provide some understanding as to the why behind the need for these new controls, or the why behind the need to address eSkimming security in general. We'll talk about the threat landscape. We'll talk about a little bit about adversarial tradecraft, and we'll talk about the urgency to really get moving on this project. Again, not just for compliance purposes, but for broader security purposes. I'm really happy to be joined today by a man that many of you may know. I've spent a lot of time over the course of the last year getting to know him. He's a great guy. Really, really smart man, and he has been at the helm of delivering sort of the preeminent report, I would say, in the payment industry for quite some time now. Siska is here. I'm Steve Ward, as I said, Chief Marketing Officer worldwide for Source Defense. Siska, you want to let them hear your voice, give an intro on yourself, and then we'll keep moving.
Yes, thanks, Steve. Kind introduction. Yeah, I'm Siska van Wisten. I'm head of global business intelligence at the Verizon Cybersecurity Consulting Services Division. And I'm also the lead researcher, data analyst, and author of the Verizon Payment Security Report.
Fantastic. Thank you. If any of you were at PCI North America, you might have seen Siska and I on stage. Also presented some of this data at PCI Europe. We've intentionally kept our cameras off because PCI North America was a lot easier to tell, but these are catfishing photos. Siska and I have aged quite significantly since they were first taken. But it's a dealer's choice, if you will, and we got to choose what we looked like for these slides. So this is it. But trust, we're more war weary and battle hardened from a lot of years in cyber. But anyway, jumping in, I want to give a little background on Source Defense so you can understand the perch from which we, bring this information to the community. What our specialty and expertise is, and sort of where we play in the broader side of things. And then I want to have Siska provide a little bit of background on the Verizon PSR and the work that's been done for a number of years on it. When you think about Source Defense, we're really an organization that's been purpose built to protect data at the point of capture as it is being entered into the online forms that power the modern website and the consumer experience. We are a solution that I think is incredibly necessary to round out web security. We deal with protection at the client side. I'll explain a little bit as we get into here what that means. But really, when you look at, sort of what's being done with the rise of the need for these eSkimming security controls and where we try and, sort of position ourselves and think about ourselves, we want to be an enabler for the use of, a digital supply chain, the third-party service providers that you're going to need to rely on. We want to be not a blocker, but an organization that helps you power the business while reducing what we view as a very, very unaddressed and really pronounced element of third-party risk management. I'll get into that here in a little while. And to help you support other activities that you're already undertaking, whether they be zero trust or a focus on SBOM or third-party risk management. Source Defense kind of plays across those spaces. We're a data security, data privacy, and compliance organization. And our solution, as it's framed today, and we're in the conversation that we're having, we'll talk heavily around PCI, but there's more of a play more broadly into data privacy compliance in things like GDPR and HIPAA and FFIEC. And I'll try and expose a little bit of that for some of the organizations that are on this call, whether you be a consultant that helps clients that have like a multifaceted compliance regime, system to manage, or whether you be an organization, whether you be in healthcare or a merchant that has some dabblings. into HIPAA, or whether you're in Europe and you have a need, to really focus heavily on GDPR. We'll touch on a lot of those things. You should know, as it relates to the PCI end of things, we pride ourselves in being a really active member of this community. For multiple years now, we've been a participating organization with the PCI Council. We were what's referred to as a PCI PPO, Principal Participating Organization. We're heavily engaged in conversations around shaping the standard. We're active, as I mentioned. We're on the stage in North America, and we're at the Europe community meetings in Asia, and we're participants in multiple task force. We're trying to help the industry, whether it be QSAs, whether it be merchants, whether it be TPSPs, the entire ecosystem, really get a handle on this emerging threat. So we pride ourselves in being a partner, and we pride ourselves in bringing some free tools to the table that I want to make sure you avail yourselves of as this day unfolds and this session unfolds. Obviously, we're going to talk about the PSR data. We're going to give a link to both the full PSR as well as to the elements of the data that relate to the eSkimming side of things as we go along here. We have support for you that is not our words, but that's been harnessed from all the work that we do with the global QSA and the QSAC community around scoping, what you need to be thinking about, what's in scope, roles, responsibilities, things of that nature. Some guidance on build versus procure. We offer team education sessions. We're getting a little late in the calendar timeframe, with about 5 months left before you need to have these controls in place, but never too late. If you need education and you need help, you need us to come in and talk to your organization, you can ask us anything. We'll answer as best we can based on all the knowledge that we have. We've got some tools for pre-project website assessment, and then we'll actually do group working sessions with your QSAs. So if you have questions and you want to bring your consultant in, and you want some advice from an expert in the space, and you want to bring the QSA to the tables as well, we're happy to facilitate that. Chances are we work with them, we know them, we've been on calls with them, we've seen them, et cetera, et cetera. And then we've got a 90-day action plan that can be really useful to help you accelerate here if you aren't already moving. Cisco, maybe give a little bit of background, Verizon, your role there, and then I think more broadly in the context of this conversation, the PSR, what it is, what you guys do it for, what merchants and the community can take away from it. Why don't you just talk a little bit about that for us?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Steve. So Verizon is a prominent cybersecurity consulting organization with at least 25 years of service delivery in that space. And a lot of the listeners here will be familiar with our thought leadership publications, the groundbreaking Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, which was followed 1 year later with the Payment Security Report many, many years ago, and the Mobile Security Index and other publications. So we are quite excited with this 2024 edition of the Verizon Payment Security Report that we launched on October 3rd this year. And the subject focus on the measurement, evaluation, and improvement of security programs. But for people that are unfamiliar with the Verizon Payment Security Report, so it was first published in 2010. We started writing that in 2009. And it was the first research publication that provided really comprehensive review of the performance of PCI data security standards with comparisons between industries and geographic regions. Now, today, 15 years later, we have annual publications, and it remains the leading publication in this field. And we've collected a sizable compendium of research over the years. If you can imagine all of this material that we've published, it's, I would guess, probably over 1,000 pages by now. But it provides really tremendous insights on PCI security, the regulation, the perspectives of how the requirements and the regulation, the program itself evolves, the impact on businesses, and how to overcome the challenges of remaining compliant. So especially with PCI DSS version 4.0, which was the most substantial update to the PCI data security standard in 17 years since its launch, there's so many opportunities and also a lot more flexibility to design controls and to succeed in a very tailored manner specific to the needs of any organization. So what we will be going through in this webinar as well is just to understand what are the lessons that we've learned. There's been between 2 and 4 years of transitioning from PCI DSS version 3.2.1 to 4.0. We know that that version 4.0.1, that incremental update, will go into effect in a few weeks at the time of this recording. So for this webinar, we know that there are long-standing challenges associated with several of the requirements that organizations should address, specifically around key requirements 11 and 6. which we will be looking at this presentation. So with that mandatory compliance deadline that Steve also mentioned, a lot of organizations by now have already validated their compliance against 4.0. And we know that the majority of the new requirements will go into effect in March 2025, at least a potential of 51 of them. Only 13 new PCI DSS 4.0 requirements went into effect in March this year, 2024. So there's a lot that needs to be done to protect data that can be exposed by third-party scripts, and that's why it needs a lot of attention. And this is also why it's so important at this specific time in this long journey of PCI security compliance. How do you assess the performance of your compliance program? How do you understand that the outcomes that you need to achieve with all of the investment, all of the hard work that went into getting where you are at the moment? So with this, we also saw the end of PCI DSS 3.x. Remember that version 3.2.1 was the longest running standard so far with the PCI regulation history. And this is what we will quickly go through also in this presentation. We will mention that we have long-term trends that are fairly consistent. We know that requirements 6 and 11 are poor performance, and that's covered in the state of compliance section of the payment security report. And what we will be discussing today is also how do you improve your capability to strengthen the effectiveness and sustainability, and that's much needed. So looking forward to that. Back to you, Steve.
Thank you, Siska. I'm still here. Don't worry. Just had to unmute myself. Let's dive in a little bit here and talk about where the puck has shifted to. If you understand what I'm referring to, it's a hockey adage, but the landscape has moved, and we need to understand that the work that we've done over the years to protect data in transit and data at rest has been phenomenal. I think we've shored up a really significant portion of the threat landscape as a result. But obviously our adversaries are constantly evolving. Our businesses are evolving, and our adversaries are always looking for ways to find chinks in the armor and to find new ways to take advantage of us, to impact our organizations, to impact the consumers that we serve, to put card data at risk, to put PII at risk, et cetera. As Siska had mentioned, 4.0.1 now, and there'll, I'm sure, be multiple dot versions of it, is the first significant change, major overhaul in the standard in quite some time. And there's 50 plus changes, that come along with it. One of the most significant new scope, never before seen, is this focus in 643 and 1161 on preventing eSkimming, on these eSkimming security controls. The reason behind that, if you really look at it, is let's just take a little history lesson, right? Like 20 years ago, the dawn of PCI, right? What did it come about from? The card associations consolidated sort of their disparate security programs. They gave us one sort of blueprint for how to manage security and how to look at the problems that existed in the world. You could argue it was in response to some of the initial first, high profile breaches, that led to sort of the golden age of identity theft and of card data theft. One of the biggest card processing companies in the world at the time, had data that was stolen from the network, unencrypted, gave rise to our focus on protecting data at rest, right? It's about 20 years since both that and PCI came to fruition. It's about 11 years since one of the most high profile merchant-based breaches occurred. My wife's favorite retailer, won't mention them, but you can just imagine that you can't get out of there. You go in for something, you can't get out with spending like $200. That's how great their products are on the shelf. My identity was stolen. 40 million other people's identities were stolen, or 40 million credit cards taken, 70 million identities stolen in that breach. That came from a third-party service provider being compromised, and it gave rise to our focus on the need to focus on third-party risk. And it really taught the adversary, that the supply chain is, the weak underbelly of most security programs. And taught them that focusing on third parties was a good way to get into the target rich environment of the primary target that you're after. With the sort of change in the way that we operate and the rise of e-commerce and the shift in the way that the modern website functions, we've got ourselves a third-party risk management solution, got ourselves a third-party digital supply chain, that needs to be protected, that the adversary is going after. And so while data in transit and data at rest, you may say is, pretty well taken care of, not complete, right? There's a lot that we always need to continually do. What's happened is there's been a shift to stealing data at the point of input, directly as it's being entered into the online forms that power our digital storefronts. So that's our new community challenge. And that's why there's such an emphasis and so much dialogue around this in the community. We've got to do something to stop this eSkimming threat. We've got to do something to shore up this new supply chain, this digital supply chain, which is unmonitored, unmanaged, unprotected, highly targeted. And it deals with JavaScript. And so that's where we talk about the rise and risk of third-party scripts, right? And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But it comes in the form of multiple attacks that you might hear: Magecart, eSkimming, form jacking, clickjacking, credential harvesting, anything that the adversary can do, to grab data, like literally as it's being put into the forms on your modern website, they're doing. And so let's talk a little bit about, kind of how we got here. This is meant to help you educate inside your organization. I know a lot of people need to go back to risk committees, or they need to talk to folks across the organization, whether it be stakeholders in the digital side, the marketing side, the e-com business holders, right? Or you need to talk to security or compliance, depending upon your role. Having some of this background, I think, is really important. We talk about the EMV liability shift being a major move, to reduce fraud or credit card fraud. And, it has worked, right? The shift to card not present has become the target, almost directly in line with the completion of the EMV liability shift. Europe was way ahead, the rest of the world way ahead, and America didn't, catch up until 15. But in 2016, like clockwork, you see the dawn of these Magecart attacks happening. That's when the first, real sort of high volume attacks started occurring. Within a couple of years, you see the first high profile attacks: major airline, major ticketing organization. An interesting note, and because I want to touch on this, as I said at the top, it's not just security, but there's some data privacy elements that you need to understand in terms of managing this risk. Interesting side note is that, one of those attacks jumped the transom, if you will, and it wasn't just about card data. It was about, the exposure of GDPR protected information impacting, a really large number of individuals, that led to the first very, very teethy GDPR fine to the tune of 200 million bucks. Now it was settled down to 20 million, still relative, still material. But you can imagine if a $200 million hit came on the back of one of these attacks, this is something you should be focusing on, and should be focusing on a lot, and probably with a higher profile than is being done in the industry. Why is that? If you look at what happened in 2020, the world got kicked up into upheaval, right? And at the same time, you're seeing this massive shift towards e-commerce, because that's the way we could purchase. You're seeing all these other high-profile attacks, the dawn of ransomware, right? The scourge of other forms of supply chain attacks like Cassia and others. And so it kind of sucked the oxygen out of the conversation related to eSkimming, but it did not stop the adversary from advancing their capabilities and from driving these attacks forward. You still see high-profile breaches. You see a shift on the part of the adversary to actually target our small merchant communities, one-to-many type of attacks. And, we'll talk a little bit about how that's possible when we get into what these scripts are doing and script utilization. In response to this growing drumbeat of these types of attacks, and to really a shift in the fraud profile, the card associations and the PCI Council introduced PCI DSS 4.0 in 2022. And so for the better part of, almost 3 years now, the controls required under 643 and 1161 have been prescribed as best practice. They told you should do this because the threat exists. A lot of people on this call probably just getting to it now because, man, there's a lot of other priorities in the world, but the threat still exists. And that's what I want to sort of hammer home in terms of some of the urgency, the need to get moving. And there's some data I'll reference in terms of like some changes in the threat landscape that we're seeing that really should hammer home, like, act now, don't wait. This is a security concern, not just a compliance concern. In 2023, 100 million plus cards were available online, with the vast majority of them being CNP. So they were stolen through these types of eSkimming attacks. And so, you can see the emphasis, in terms of like the high profile need there. We've seen an increase in the threat surface. And by that, what I mean is a growth in the use of digital supply chain partners. So we're seeing expanding use of third and fourth and fifth parties on the modern website. So our attack surface is getting broader. The controls are required. Most people have delayed putting them in place. The attacks have been going on for some number of years. They're really impactful. Right over the horizon, is the time where we finally have to put this thing, directly and squarely in our security focus and in our compliance focus, because in March 31st, 2025, these controls are required. Okay. So act now, learn now, educate now, as fast as you can inside your organization. So on that education front, what is the problem? Well, the problem is JavaScript for the most part, right? The modern website is comprised and compiled of JavaScript. JavaScript can basically do anything it wants. It's everything, everywhere, all at once. To steal from that popular Netflix movie. Effectively, client-side security, right? eSkimming security controls starts with control over JavaScript, and it starts with controlling what is loaded into, or the consumer browser, and ensuring that the scripts that are loaded into that browser session times x millions and billions, right, have controls over top of them. For the most part, there are no native security controls. For the most part, the vast majority of scripts that are out there are not currently monitored, managed, or prevented from doing anything malicious. So much so that the vast majority of scripts that are running on your website, most likely, are outside of your control, and they're being called in with no controls in place, with no understanding of whether or not the scripts have been compromised, with no ability to vet, whether or not they're valid or they've been compromised to perform malicious behavior. 82% is what we found. 82% of code and actions running on, in average on the website are outside of your control. And so these are very necessary things. These are things that, as I mentioned, being an enabler for the business, you want to have in place, right? It's everything from chatbots and analytics and social connectivity, all of the things that, sort of the modern consumer wants and demands in terms of like a feature-rich website experience, all of the things that the business demands in terms of being able to better target and drive wallet share and understand what's going on in the business. These are things that have to happen. But these are things that just are running wild. And forget zero trust. This is total trust kind of environment. And I put this one here, this polyfill.io, as a really recent and I think applicable case study in the problem. This was a legitimate service that was designed to help outdated browsers interact with modern website functionality. So it's a service that basically was put out there, open source, said, hey, if you plug this in, it'll run on the client side, and it will, help overcome browser incompatibility issues. And so, as you might imagine, millions upon millions of websites, need that functionality. They were calling in and accessing what was deemed to be a legitimate script from a CDN that had been compromised by a Chinese threat actor. And so, unbeknownst to 5 million websites out in the world, they were loading in code in every consumer session that was redirecting consumers to nefarious sites. That was, in our analysis, scraping for PII and credentials data. It highlights home the situation. So Polyfill.io is a recent news case that I think should really hammer home some of the need if you get any pushback inside the organization. What really makes the fact that these scripts are unmanaged so dangerous is that JavaScript is highly interactive with the session. It by its design is actually performing a lot of activities that are almost mirror malware. Okay. And you should understand this, and this is what gets into a little bit of the data privacy concern as well. And there's needs for it. There's a reason for it, right? Changing page content, right? In a benign environment, consumer selection, consumer browsing behavior in that session, clicking and adding things to cart. You're going to want to offer up different capabilities, different products, different offerings. And so you're going to want to change the page content and load things in based on that session, adding content, images, text, video, form fields. These are all things that, have a legitimate purpose. But when you think about what an adversary might want to do, putting a checkout button that isn't going to your checkout, adding a form field that asks for sensitive PII or card data when it wasn't intended, recording keystrokes, grabbing credentials, right? Harvesting login, exfiltrating personal data, and redirecting visitors to other websites. These are all things an adversary will want to do. And so when you think about two things, you think about all the stuff that you're letting run natively that in its benign fashion has some pretty like overreaching, highly sensitive, touches that are going on. And then marry that with an adversary's desire to get in and break into your systems or to steal, consumer data at the point of input. It really lowers the barrier for the adversary. And that's why exploit kits around MageCart or around, eSkimming are dirt cheap in the underground, like $1,000 for an exploit kit. I put some asterisks next to this page content, adding content and redirecting visitors. I'll come back to that in a minute. So the problem's been acknowledged. We got to do something about it. The card associations have been warning for multiple years. I use an older quote here because it hammers it home. This is not Visa is continuing to warn about this in their biannual threat reports, but all the way back in June 2022, right, just after DSS 4.0 was released, they're saying the targeting of e-commerce platforms and these third-party code integrations is the most common tactic utilized by threat actors. They're going after this supply chain. They're targeting these third parties. You've got to do something about it. And that's when the council took action with 4.0.1. They say we've got to confirm that every script that runs on the payment page is authorized. We've got to ensure the integrity of the script. We got to maintain an inventory. We got to monitor page headers. We got to alert and block on malicious scripts on these payment pages. There's a blueprint now, for what needs to be done to try and cut off the eSkimming threat. But there's a lot that still needs to be done in terms of understanding how to get it done, what to do, how to do it, etc. Before I jump into like the data side of things, I just want to come back to the pin I placed on what am I trying to say? The data privacy compliance side of things. And that is, I'm sorry, on the data privacy end of things, there are a number of cases where the scripts that are running on websites are reading into form fields they shouldn't be reading into and taking data that they shouldn't have access to and compromising things like HIPAA compliance and GDPR compliance. And there's some stuff that's out there. You can Google it, lawsuits that have popped up where, popular social pixels that have been put on are grabbing and scraping data that's highly sensitive from a healthcare perspective and feeding knowledge, advertisements, things of that nature that shouldn't be knowledgeable to them. Dig into that, because if you've got more than just a card data concern, you're going to want to make sure that you understand what the data privacy concern is as well. So let's talk about the scope of the problem. I want to do some preamble there. I want to get into the data now. It's basically everybody's problem, regardless of industry or geography. What we did in partnership with Verizon for the PSR was we looked at 7,000 of the world's largest websites. We didn't specify only e-commerce. So this is across multiple types of industry, if you will, different forms of retail, different forms of consumer-facing websites, right? We looked at North America, Europe, Latin America. We wanted to get a general sense for how broadly utilized are scripts, provide some benchmarking for the community, let you understand what types of scripts people typically use, how it breaks down by sub-industry, and let you know some of the behaviors that we're seeing with those scripts that are alarming in their normal state, and that, create that low barrier of entry for the adversary. What we found is, 130,000 scripts across this 7,000 website kind of universe. And we saw third-party scripts, fourth-party scripts, fifth-party scripts. One of the things that's very important to understand is that it's not just the partner that you're working with. And I'll just use an example, Google Analytics, right? Or anything in the Google Service Suite. Those scripts call in on other third parties, fourth parties, fifth parties. So the supply chain has a supply chain. And when you think about supply chain management, third party risk, it's a real problem because it doesn't even have to be a compromise of one of the most popular scripts in use. It could be a downstream partner that is compromised that, all right, well, just because there's scripts in place on a website doesn't mean that, those scripts are, having access to any sensitive data or in highly sensitive places. That is also untrue. 40% of the scripts that we found were actually in the payment environment on payment pages. Okay. There's a widespread and growing use of this digital supply chain. There's not a lot of knowledge on what we're allowing to happen inside our websites. In many instances, when we talk to clients that we support, the security and the compliance teams aren't even involved in deciding what goes on the website. And so there's been a wild west happening out there where 18 scripts on average are in place across the website. Okay. These scripts are doing everything from accessing credentials to accessing card data, and in some cases that's legitimate, but it's still risky. Accessing PII, transferring data, sniffing, key logging, things of that nature. So it's a really pronounced, really broad landscape of third parties you need to manage. There are dozens of them. That 18 is an average. In some cases, we've seen as high as 60, 70, 80 different partners in place. Sometimes because there's no good change control and nobody's monitoring that, either outdated or unmanaged scripts are running on the website. It's just, oh, we forgot about that, or the last regime, put that in place and we didn't clean it up. But it's a big problem. It's a growing problem. It's a big landscape. We're hammering home, the problem as it relates to what adversaries are able to do. I want to talk just real briefly about how it breaks down by type of website. We found certain industries are more reliant on third parties, and it kind of makes sense. If you've got a strong online presence, if you've got a highly customizable product or product offerings, and if you have lower initial customer conversion, you tend to use a lot more of these third and fourth parties. And so an industry like apparel and fashion, very, very, very high use of these third parties. Why? Sizes, colors, the desire to recommend a hat that goes with a shirt, a blouse that goes with a skirt, whatever it might be, and the fact that generally people don't purchase on the first buy. The same thing in technology, food and beverage, etc. Anyway, I want to be cognizant of time. I want to get Cisco back in here and talk a little bit more about the PSR and things, and maybe see if I can deal with my microphone issue. I've got a lot more to share with you for the session, but we're kind of running out of time. So this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the data that's there. I want you to get dug into that. I want you to use that data again as a benchmark, as an understanding what's going on, as a way to look at your website environment and see where you stack against your peers, and as a way to educate the community of stakeholders inside your organization. So Cisco, let me toss it back over to you for some of the more broader PSR stuff.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Steve. So, I mean, Steve, the details and the insight that you get from what you've presented, which is published in that Appendix A of the Verizon 2024 PSR, it's just exceptional and so insightful. And you can read and reread it, and it provides such fantastic perspective. With the quality of the data that Source Defense is presenting in that piece is really magnificent. And it's so useful to make data-driven decisions about the threats, the vulnerabilities, and the likely impact. And that is what we've been a proponent of as well, is to really know where you stand and to see things for what they are based on credible data. So what we're looking at here is the program lifecycle management. So organizations need to manage their PCI security compliance, and it's not going to happen by itself. And it's also the first principle of compliance management, which we've often repeated and republished over the years, is to say that as a first principle, success is achieved by design, not by luck. You need to put in the work to reduce the complexity of compliance management, and you need to make it easier to know what is the right work that needs to be done and how do you do that work right. So in other words, how do you direct and manage the people and the teams involved in compliance to be effective and efficient at what they do, and how they're going to overcome these challenges that you have with requirements 6 and 11 and third-party scripts? And you need to do that work in a structured manner. So this is why we develop models and frameworks to help with this. And over the years, we've seen what work, we've seen which approaches do not work well, and we thoroughly understand why, because there's clear patterns, cause and effect relationships. As Steve mentioned earlier in this presentation, PCI security is not new. It's been 20 years. So it's no longer the case that we have to guess what the next moves are. We've seen it before. And in this 2024 publication, we published new models, and we've also republished previous models that we've published before and show how they apply and can be integrated into an integrated method to measure, evaluate, and improve the performance of your PCI security program. So these models have withstood the test of time. Some of them have been applied in practice to many organizations, large and small, across many industries and geographic regions for the past 15 years. And we do refine them. I mean, most of them continue to work really well without the need for any significant change. And these models can be adapted and tailored to any organization. So we republished this security program lifecycle management diagram, and I'll quickly walk you through this. So the first thing to understand is that it's really surprising as a QSA, a Qualified Security Assess organization, that we've done thousands of assessments. I think we are standing at this rate at around 24,000 assessments, and we are only counting since 2009. You can see how many organizations do not maintain overall perspective of their program to know, I mean, where are they in the overall process at any given point in time. So compliance management involves a lot of communication, as all of you know. You need people to sit around a table and talk constructively. You need people to share emails and share reports. There's a large volume of communication going on, and time is very precious. You know that it's probably our most precious commodity, time. You cannot replace it. So therefore, you need to be productive. You need your teams to be productive and avoid unnecessary work, unnecessary communication. So any conversation or email or document fit somewhere into a specific place in the overall process of compliance management. So here on this slide, you can see the three major phases of a security compliance program. You see phase one, program planning and design, program execution and management, and program evaluation and improvement there at the bar at the top. So it's a very logical flow and layout of the work that needs to be done. So with the first phase one, program planning and design, you have to plan to plan. You have to plan to design the program. It's a lot of groundwork that needs to go into setting yourself up for success. So planning is crucial for coordination, for efficient communication, for direction and instruction of all the participants. So if you go down one row, you see the activities: program conception and initiation. So you need to establish a program office. You need to get the right people, the teams, the departments, all the participants and stakeholders involved and aligned with where you're trying to, what you're trying to accomplish. And therefore you need a program charter that documents the purpose of the program. What is the value of security, compliance, and management? What is the value of cybersecurity and PCI security specifically? So why does it matter? Why is it important to manage risk and control the function across the business? So you need to define and plan the work. You need to document and communicate your program plan clearly to see exactly, everybody needs to understand in alignment what is the goal of the program. You need to break the goal down into incremental objectives and analyze what are the requirements. So in other words, what are the conditions that needs to be in place to meet those objectives, and what are the constraints? A lot of PCI is understanding which constraints are the biggest constraints that you need to identify and remove first. So we've published the logical thinking process with an exact specification of how do you get this work done effectively and efficiently. And that is published in the 2022 edition of the Verizon Payment Security Report. So with this latest edition, when you read the 2024 edition of the Payment Security Report, we included a lot of links to previous editions so that you can easily identify which edition in which year and on which exact page do you find more information that we've covered in the past. So now next, when you launch the program as part of the execution and management phase, it involves still a lot of communication, and you need to track the work. You need to make sure that the expectations of quality, whatever is being produced, will be met. You need to forecast on how the activities and tasks will be completed on time, on budget. So throughout this process, you have opportunities to measure and evaluate and improve the performance and the control of the program. And that is an area that needs attention. This is why we focus so much on that in this specific edition. Now, on phase 3, evaluation and improvement, organizations should have defined a plan for how do you structure the work that needs to be done and to report the effectiveness and the efficiency of your program, to know whether your program results and the controls as well as your control environment will actually be effective at protecting the data. This is what we're saying as well, that there are areas and blind spots that you can easily miss, such as scripts in your websites that can expose you. And that is what PCI security is all about, is to make sure that you are protecting the data wherever it may be in a very consistent method. But yet, we still see organizations that are doing compliance for the sake of compliance. And they don't do this because they choose to and say, okay, it's just compliance. It's simply because sometimes they really don't know any better, and they are not taught any better. There's a lack of guidance on the methods, the models, because a PCI DSS itself has limitations, and we address that also in this edition of the PSR. What are the limitations? Don't expect more from the PCI data security standard than what it's intended to be, the function, scope, and purpose. So this is why publications such as the Verizon PSR is at the forefront to help people to truly understand how do you get direction and move forward. So many organizations, we know that there's a shortage of resources that can be allocated to security and compliance. And when you skip steps, and many organizations do, they inevitably need to circle back later and apply corrections. And they need to do work that was needed earlier on to set themselves up for success. And that's very wasteful a way to go about. And this is what we want to avoid. So you can apply this lifecycle management diagram throughout the year. You can do it every year. It's not just for new programs. Every year you need to reinitiate your annual compliance program and align it. You do not necessarily need to create everything from scratch. Obviously, a program is meant to continue over many, many years, but you need to revisit your plan and launch the projects, etc. So moving on to the next slide, when we look at how do you measure the success, essentially, you need to understand the overall success of a PCI security program. There's a lot of benefits to understanding what should you be aiming at. What are the success factors? So it's helped a lot to look at these 5 items that you can use to measure the success of your program against. So to begin with, it's number 1, it must be effective. Number 2, strategically aligned. Then efficient and economical. It must be sustainable. And the program itself must be capable of ongoing improvement. So I'll quickly just step through this. You need to understand, how do you know that your program is truly effective? The program must be effective, and with effective, I mean, we are referring to several aspects of the program. At a basic level, the PCI DSS controls and the requirements themselves must be effective. They exist within a control environment, things that can influence the controls, that must be effective as well. So those are major goals, but the program itself, the way in which you execute the work and the strategy, that should be effective too. And then number 2, is the program strategically aligned with the rest of the business? You don't want to be competing and be misaligned with the rest of the business. Security and compliance, really, there must be support, both in terms of the mission and the objectives throughout the business to help both the effort of compliance and the business itself to succeed. So better alignment is really much easier to maintain ongoing support from the organization for all of your security and compliance program efforts. And then number 3, is your program economical? We know that everything in life is finite. There's a finite amount of resources. There's resource scarcity. So that's why security and compliance is definitely always an economic model. So your program needs to be successful when it's done efficiently. You need to limit the amount of waste of time, money, effort, and attention. Number 4, is the program sustainable? So the success as well that you need to measure it against is all of this effort that you put in that requires... You need to understand the performance of the program, the work, and the performance of the security controls themselves and the control environment. That must be sustained. It's a marathon, not a sprint. So we know that it needs to be sustained for a long period of time without any significant deviation. And it should be rare for processes and controls and other requirements to break down and fall out of place and require fixing. And the last point is capability improvement. Does your program include the measurement and reporting of the capabilities? the competencies of individuals, the capabilities of the teams, for making sure that the processes work really well, that you can continue to improve them. So if you have all of these 5 critical success factors in place, generally you have a good, successful program. Now, when we move on to the next slide, here you can see the scope of the PCI security program. It's always good. We've looked at the PCI DSS program lifecycle in the 2 previous slides. But now when you zoom out, if you take a bigger view, you can see the actual work. Where does the program fit into the larger picture? So these steps help you it will really help you to understand how do you develop, execute, and improve your program. And it will help you to understand where does the program fit into that larger picture. The program exists within the organization. As I said, it needs support and a foundation. So this security management canvas is a model that is very useful. We've been publishing it for many years. It continues to be slightly refined, but it is groundbreaking in nature. This is a very unique model, and it places the activities of the program into the correct perspective and position. So I'm not going to go into too much detail of this model, but it's the position of the program on pillar 5 is for very good reason. The program depends on input from the previous 4 pillars. So when you think about it, the scope of your PCI measurement, evaluation, and improvement program, this is the overall frame that contains all of the essential elements. Each one needs to have a documented plan for how should you evaluate, the frequency of the evaluation, how do you report the results of your PCI program, and provide input for making good, sound decisions on what is the best, what is the most logical way to move forward. So having this documented business model to begin with, that is on pillar 1 for a reason. It's so much easier to communicate the value of compliance and make sure that that is used as input to create a really practical strategy. How are you going to take the scarce resources that you have, time, people, budget, attention, money, and align them with a prioritized set of objectives to achieve the overall goal of PCI. So it really helps to have the business model in place, then the security strategy, and then also with your strategy that feeds into your security operating model. And the operating model is really just a collection of essential documents that defines your operational environment, the people, the processes, and the technology across your environment. So the operating model and the program then needs to align with a collection of standards and frameworks that your organization have adopted for governance, risk management, and compliance. Because as we've said many times, PCI DSS, often it doesn't stand by itself. You can do so much more by complementing and supplementing it with additional standards and frameworks out there. So this model really, it lays out the broader scope, the essential elements within security management and how they relate to one another. And it helps to determine what is the work that needs to be done, which conversations need to happen, which decisions and directives needs to be communicated, and at what time in this overall process. So it really presents a great value chain of inputs, processes, and outputs that moves not only from the left to right across these pillars on the slide, but also back and forth. I mean, there are dependencies and interdependencies between the work that you do, these pillars with feedback loops. So this is not only a very elegant model, but it's an incredibly practical and useful framework that provides a clear directive on how to structure the work that needs to be done for you to succeed with PCI security compliance, to make the processes and outcomes so much more predictable, to avoid all of those nasty, unexpected surprises. So it gives a fantastic perspective on the scope, and it makes the performance of the work so much more efficient and effective. So moving on from this to the next slide, back to you, Steve.
Yeah, so it's funny, Siska, you were talking and very very good focus on efficiency and scarcity of time. I have to apologize. It's almost hilarious. I went long, and Siska and I had done the whole presentation in 20 minutes on a stage. If you can believe it or not, I think I talked for about 30. So we've kind of got a little bit of a narrow window left for Q&A. And what I want to do is, instead of going to a lot more stuff that I had planned for you, I want to start addressing questions. We have one that actually helps me jump forward to a section that I wanted to touch on, is the scoping. Is the build versus buy. Okay. One issue that I think really needs to be brought to your attention relates to the guidance that you'll find in the standard, where they call out CSP and they call out SRI as techniques, to address this problem. Don't just take my word for it. You can listen to the voices of pretty much everybody, with technical knowledge on this. And we have a bunch of folks in the QSA community, sort of echoing this. But CSP is not going to get the job done. And I'll tell you why, first and foremost. So the question was like, well, how does the source defense approach compare with ensuring your libraries are signed? Okay, so CSP, the very nature of that question, right, gets to the notion of CSP as a whitelisting approach, right? The validation and signing. We can't deal with this problem, in the traditional manner. We have an issue, where scripts are heavily dynamic. They change by time of day, by geography, etc. We've got one client that has seen somewhere on the order of like 7,000 changes to scripts a quarter, across their websites. You're not going to whitelist your way out of this problem. I mentioned the polyfill IO use case up top when we started this conversation. The vast majority of websites that had CSP in place had approved the polyfill service. It was compromised. So, it's a binary kind of approach, on or off. Okay. Where source defense comes into play is we are a behavioral based control over top of third party scripts, even over top of first party scripts. What we are doing is we are basically, creating a sandbox where the scripts run, we control their behavior and allow or deny access to sensitive information, on the website. And so this is responsive, to the evolution of the threat, not a whitelist, blacklist kind of approach, which is just bypassed with complete ease by the adversary. We've got a white paper that, Scott, if you could put the white paper out there, that Viking Cloud had done where they addressed the issue of CSP and a few things that they talk about. Complexity in implementation. When Cisco is, talking about operational efficiency and scarcity of resources and scarcity of time and scarcity of money. There is a heavily complex undertaking to think you can even implement and manage CSP across at least a dynamic website. It's challenging. It requires extensive technical knowledge. It's going to put a strain on your resources, but again, it's not going to be effective against the tradecraft that the adversary is using or against the examples of what we see, out there in the wild. Overblocking versus underblocking, again, completely static in nature, on or off. And then a massive maintenance burn. So we kind of take a little bit of issue, and this is echoed, across the community with the guidance that's found in the standard, which references CSP, because too often when that guidance is given, people say, well, that's what it's saying I must use. And there's a third element of guidance. They say CSP, SRI, or commercially available product from, a vendor in this space. And so, take a look at us. We're super easy to look at. But Scott, if you could also push the PCI North America video, you'll hear voices from the QSA community warning you against this approach. So I hope that answers your question. And I know it went a little long on it, but there were actually slides I wanted to touch on that front. If we have other questions, I want to make sure they get answered. So Scott, if you can help me with the QSA with the Q&A end of things, that'd be great.
I have other questions. Let me see. I know the deadline for these controls is approaching, but is there any fudgeability in timing for deployment? Do they have to be deployed by March 31st if I've had an ROC prior?
Okay, so this is one that is, heavily asked question, because it looks like the time window for implementation, is getting shorter and shorter. It is. If you've not done something, you are coming up against a deadline. Keep in mind a couple things. These controls were future dated controls. And what that means in the standard is they gave you a 2-year runway for implementation, almost a 3-year runway for implementation. The council, is not going to change the deadline. So there's no change coming. There's no saving grace coming on that end of things. We're heavily engaged, with them, and this is a conversation that has come up multiple times. There's not going to be a saving grace, wait till the last minute and they give you more time. You got to get moving. As it relates to the rock question, you've done a rock, maybe your rock is coming up and it's going to be December, right? And you're going to get your QSA in there if you're a level 1 merchant, and they're going to certify you against the requirement, because it hasn't become mandatory, these controls, until March. Sure. You'll likely hear from them that they're getting a lot of pressure from the card associations to have a detailed plan on your part in terms of when you are going to have these controls implemented. It's not like you're going to be able to say, well, I've got until next December when they come in, and therefore I'll address it on November, whatever the date, right? And have the controls in before, the next certification comes around. There's a lot of pressure from the card associations because of the level of risk they're seeing here related to this, to make sure that we all hit this time frame. So I wouldn't think there's you got to get moving. And there's a lot of voices on that in the video. Scott sharing this North America video from the QSA community to the same. All right, Scott, what else you got?
Okay, here's another one. Requirements 6 and 7 are perennial bad performers. Do you provide any guidance in this or PSRs related to how to improve on these requirements?
Cisco, that's yours.
Yeah, certainly, definitely. When we've seen requirement 6 and requirement 11 being bad performance, and it's not just recent, it's over 10 years. So we publish that every year in the payment security report. And definitely, it's not just perspective on the problem to say, okay, requirements 6 and 11 are bad performers. If you look at the 2024 edition, you will actually see that as we highlight the problem, for example, requirement 6 is on page 63. And if the moment you go on to page 64 and 65, we give you the direction of the solution. And it's the same with requirement 11. We explain in every payment security report what are the challenges, why exactly are organizations struggling, and then how do you overcome that? So definitely, please have a look at that in the report, and you're welcome to reach out for more details.
Yeah, and Scott has placed a link to the 2024 PSR in there, the Viking Cloud wiper I just referenced on build versus buy, the video. I know we're almost out of time here. I want to make sure we answer any questions that you guys have if you want to stick around. Are there any more questions from the field that we can address? I'll skip ahead to.
Sure. Do you monitor eSkimming attacks? Are you seeing any change in the trends?
Yeah, we do a lot of research, threat research in this regard. One thing, oh, hang on, wrong. Thank you, Paige. I don't think I updated that. One thing you need to understand, well, Cisco, you're going to have to read it. Hey, we'll get your email address out there in 1 second. One thing you need to understand is that there has been a massive uptick in these eSkimming attacks. We're seeing it. The folks at the card associations are seeing it. We're seeing attacks in the multiple hundreds per day. A lot of information being fed back to the PFI community. A lot of breach type response, getting kicked in to high gear. So the threat is there. It is pronounced. You may not hear it every day in the news, but I think there's two prongs to that. One, we don't have controls in place, and our websites are not attenuated to discover these threats. And so there's probably a lot going on that you're not hearing about. And two, it's just not it's not what drives the headlines anymore. But it doesn't mean this isn't a major problem. Siska has dropped his email into the chat. I'm Steve at sourcedefense.com. We want to help you in any way we can. So you can reach out to either of us, and we'll gladly, respond if you got more questions, or if you need to be connected to somebody, or if you, just ask. Okay. This is a community. We look at it as a community effort. We're here to be a partner with you guys. So there's no stupid questions, and there's no ask too big. Drop me a line if I can help in any way. Drop Cisco a line if he can as well. And I think I'll let everybody get back to their day at this point. Cisco, do you have any parting thoughts before we drop off?
Yeah, no, thank you, Steve. Yeah, definitely, compliance is a journey. We all learn together. We've got this philosophy of abundance. There's so much to share. So I echo what Steve is saying. Is absolutely feel free to ask. You do not need to reinvent the wheel. So much have been figured out. Just feel free to reach out, and there's abundance of resources that we can assist you with.
To that end, while I still have some folks that are here, tomorrow we're having another webinar. It is a QSA roundtable, and Scott has just put a link to that QSA roundtable invite or registration page in the chat. So if you're still here and active and you want to come to that, this is, I think, our 6th roundtable where we've had leading QSAs, you know, they're talking. It's an AMA style kind of conversation. So if you want to get some assessor based expertise, come to that roundtable tomorrow. And other than that, like I said, reach out. Thank you very much for taking the time. Hopefully there's some value here. I apologize for running long. It's like they say, you know, when you got to follow a script, you can. When you wing it, you never know what's going to go wrong. So I bloviated, but there's more to talk about. We're here to talk about it. You guys have a great day. Keep fighting the good fight, and we will see you on the other side.